Hello, thank you so much for joining. I'm Dr. Vanessa, and I'm an education scientist at Life Extension. Today, I wanted to talk about some outside of the box ideas for immune support. I'm sure a lot of people are still looking for vitamin C, elderberry, zinc, nutrients that are a little bit difficult to come by nowadays. And these people may not realize that there are multiple ways of supporting our complex immune system. So I wanted to give some science behind some additional nutrients that can be of some support. So to start our conversation, I did want to discuss first why certain infections can be so destructive. And what it really comes down to is inflammation. Now, to be fair, inflammation is a natural process when our immune system is trying to deal with an infection. In fact, what our immune cells do is they start to release what are called cytokines. Cytokines are signaling proteins that regulate inflammation. Some cytokines promote inflammation, some cytokines suppress inflammation. Now, our immune cells, what they typically do are release just enough cytokines that will deal with the infection or the pathogen, but yet not so many that it would create damage to our healthy tissue. However, some pathogens can actually initiate almost like an overreaction of the immune system. And this is what's called a cytokine storm. Now, I'm not talking just a small increase in cytokine release. I'm talking a mass explosion of cytokines. Now, what happens is because cytokines are proteins that can get into our bloodstream and circulate throughout our system to create more of a systemic effect. This can be very damaging, not only to the tissue of origin, but also to other organs as well. Now, I want to discuss some of the major immune cell players. So when we discuss nutrition and how those affect the immune system, we'll know how these immune cells have a role. So I'm going to point out in the middle bullet here. Now, of course, there's a lot of immune cells, or again, our immune system is very complex, but the ones of interest for our discussion will be macrophage, NK cells, known as natural killer cells, B cells, and T cells. Now, the macrophage and the NK cells are part of our innate immune system. These are the first responders. They're the first one on the scene if there's trauma or infection. So I equate this to kind of like our police force. Now, macrophage, what they do is they're these kind of amorphous cell that can kind of weave in and out of our tissue. And their job is to gobble up pathogens and digest them on the inside. Now, the NK cells work a little differently. What ends up happening if there's something that's going to affect our cells, like for example, if a virus gets into our system, viruses will find a cell that they can enter, get into our cell, and almost like hijack our cellular machinery to start replicating more viruses. The NK cells, what they're doing is surveillance to see if there's any cells, our cells, that have been infected, so it can get rid of them before the virus can replicate out of control. Now, on the other side, we have our B cells and our T cells, which are part of our adaptive immune system. Now, the adaptive immune system are not the first responders. They do have to be initiated out. So they do take a little bit more time to be activated. But when they do, they get the job done. So I equate this to kind of like our military force, a little bit more specialized in what they do. Now, B cells are a big classification of immune cells, but the ones of interest today will be the ones that create our antibodies. T cells are also a big classification of cells. For our conversation today, we will discuss the T helper cells, or the TH cells, which we'll see upcoming in the slides. So the ultimate goal here is that we want to support these immune cells. We want to make sure the macrophage, the NK cells, the B cells, and the T cells, they have what they need to do their job. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're balancing the immune response so we don't have a potential overreaction. So what does the research say? Well, whenever I'm thinking of a cloudy thunderstorm, I'm looking for some sunshine. And of course, when we think sunshine, I'm thinking vitamin D. Now, we often think of vitamin C as our first line of defense for immune support, but please don't forget the importance of vitamin D. One of the mechanisms of action that's been researched is that vitamin D can slow down the macrophage release of too many inflammatory cytokines. So vitamin D helps to balance out that inflammatory response. But at the same time, vitamin D helps the macrophage do their job more efficiently. Because remember, the macrophage, they're the gobblers. They gobble up a pathogen and digest them on the inside. Part of the digestive process is macrophage utilize an enzyme called acid phosphatase and hydrogen peroxide. Vitamin D helps with the secretion of these antimicrobial compounds inside of our macrophage. So they do help to make vitamin D helps the macrophage do its job more efficiently. In addition to that, did you know that humans make antimicrobials as well? These groups of antimicrobials that humans make are called catholictins, and vitamin D helps us to make our own natural catholictin antimicrobials. Now, there was a study that came out very recently in April of 2020. The title of the study is Evidence that Vitamin D Supplementation Could Reduce the Risk of Influenza and COVID-19 Infections and Death. Now, what the researchers were looking at is an association, not necessarily a causation. But a little call out of what the researchers were saying in the blue box, they're stating that vitamin D deficiency has been found to contribute to acute respiratory distress syndrome. Now, what this means is acute respiratory distress syndrome is the aftermath of a massive inflammatory response like a cytokine storm, and damage, oxidative damage that can happen when there's viruses, very pathogenic viruses or infections at play. So what this is showing is that low levels of vitamin D may be associated with further with complications. So really interesting article that came out very recently. Now, another nutrient that I like to think about is black cumin seed. I think of it as the great immune balancer. Now, a very important phytonutrient found in black cumin seed is thymoquinine. Now, what black cumin seed has been studied for is also to help slow down the macrophage release of too many pro-inflammatory cytokines. So helping to balance the immune response, but still on that innate immune system, like the police force, it does help to support our natural killer cell activity. So we can help to do the frontline surveillance for identifying if there's any cells that need to be gotten rid of in case they've been affected by an unwanted pathogen. In of itself, black cumin seed has antimicrobial activity. And on that adaptive immune side, like our more specialized military force of the immune system, it actually helps to balance those T cells. So this is looking at the T helper cells, or TH. Now we have two major classes of T helper cells. We have the first one, which is the T helper cell 1 group. T helper cell 1, these are the immune cells that deal with things happening inside of the cell. Like, for example, if viruses get in. Now, the T helper cell 2, a group of immune cells, they deal with things that happen outside of our cell, like, for example, parasites. Now, if we're a little bit out of balance in this response, like, for example, say we're like this, we have a stronger T helper cell 2 response than a T helper cell 1. Well, that's not to our advantage, especially if there's things out there that are affecting us inside of our cells. So we want to help to create balance for the the immune response for the T cells. And black cumin seed has been studied for that. So another nice out-of-the-box option. Now, another nutrient of importance, especially when we're talking inflammation, is curcumin. It's not just for our joints. In fact, curcumin can have a systemic effect for helping to balance and keep inflammation under control. I pulled out a study. This was published in 2015. The title is Curcumin Suppression of Cytokine Release and Cytokine Storm, a potential therapy for patients with Ebola or other serious viral infections. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the fact that curcumin is just very difficult to absorb by itself. Like, for example, this turmeric root here. If I'm chewing on the turmeric root and I'm swallowing free curcumin, it's probably not going to absorb very efficiently. And the reason why is because when I'm ingesting that free curcumin, it becomes rapidly conjugated. What that means is in the digestive tract, that curcumin, things start attaching to it, like sulfate molecules and glucuronide. When these molecules attach to curcumin, first of all, it's no longer free, it's now conjugated. And this conjugation hinders the absorption, which makes the curcumin very poorly bioavailable. I'm going to point out a research study on an enhancement to help to support the bioactivity and bioavailability of curcumin. So what this study was looking at is galactomannins mixed with the curcumin. Now, what galactomannins are, they're these sticky polysaccharides from fenugreek seeds. When we surround free curcumin with these sticky polysaccharides or galactomannins, it actually protects the free curcumin from conjugation. So if I ingest that combination called curcuma galactomannoside complex, or more easily said CGM complex, when I'm ingesting the CGM complex, the sulfates and the glucuronides can't attach because of the protection that the galactomannins provide. Plus, galactomannins are a little bit sticky, so they help the curcumin to stick to the epithelial cells to enter into circulation. What this study was looking at is the CGM complex absorption compared to just plain curcumin by itself. Like if I had that turmeric root and I pulled out the free curcumin and that's all we had, those are the two comparisons. And what they found is that the CGM complex, when they measured free curcumin, they found a 45.5 times better absorption or better bioavailability. Why we're saying bioavailability is that free curcumin is the bioactive form. If we can get the free curcumin into our body, that's what's going to provide the wonderful health benefits that curcumin provides. In addition to that, they did test for total curcumin absorption. So the curcumin alone versus the CGM complex, they found total curcumin absorption, like for example, some of it could be conjugated, 270 times better absorbed. So not all curcumin is equal in terms of its absorption. So I just wanted to point that out. So we talked about vitamin D, black cumin seed oil or black cumin seed, and also curcumin. But I have a really a really novel out of the box idea as well. Because if we do get exposed to pathogens, even if it doesn't lead to something as horrible as a cytokine storm, we can expect a little bit of inflammation to happen. If there's a little bit of inflammation, what we want to do is quickly resolve it and support tissue repair, because even a little bit of inflammation can create tissue problems. So what we want to do is we want to support a quick resolution and supporting a quick resolution of inflammation and supporting the repair of the tissue. So for example, if we have an acute inflammation process happening because of an infection, we want to move it into that tissue repair. Now there's 3 steps involved into that moving into tissue repair and regeneration. The first step is the cleanup. If we equate inflammation like a tornado. If we have a tornado that whips through a town, before we can start rebuilding, we have to clean up the debris. Our tissues are no different. So we do have to clean up that aftermath debris from the inflammatory process. Also, step 2, there's no point in starting the repair process if another tornado is just around the corner. So it's very important that we balance the cytokines to help ensure that another tornado doesn't come around. And then, of course, number 3, step 3, is going to be stimulating that tissue repair and rebuilding. So how do we accomplish this? Well, our body it does actually create what are called pro-resolving mediators. So let's meet these mediators our body makes. The mediators include resolvins, protectins, and myricins. Again, these are called specialized pro-resolving mediators. Now, the trick is they're created on demand, right when our body needs it. So once the immune cells have dealt with an infection or a pathogen, we need to make these specialized pro-resolving mediators immediately to help wind down the inflammatory response and start the repair. Now, these pro-resolving mediators are created from precursors. So we have to have the precursors at the ready. These precursors include 18-hydroxy-icosapentaenoic acid, 17-hydroxy-docosahexaenoic acid, and 14-hydroxy-docosahexaenoic acid. Those names may sound familiar, like EPA and DHA, which are the long-chain omega-3 fats found in fish oil. Now, fish oil, the EPA and DHA, so the EPA would be the icosapentaenoic acid, and the DHA is docosahexaenoic acid. There's actually a pretty high demand for those in the body because the EPA and DHA are not just shuttled into making those precursors for specialized pro-resolving mediators, they're also utilized for making other hormone-like molecules like our prostaglandins, leukotrienes, thromboxanes. So there's a very high demand. As we age, the shuttling of EPA and DHA into the metabolites for creating our specialized pro-resolving mediators can actually start to decline. There's also studies showing that metabolic syndrome, carrying extra weight, moving into blood sugar dysregulation can also slow down the creation of these precursors for the specialized pro-resolving mediators. So we could argue just bringing in these precursors so they're at the ready for helping to resolve inflammation and support tissue repair. We may need to include those if we're also utilizing fish oil, like our EPA and DHA. Another thing I wanted to point out is the names of these specialized pro-resolving mediators. Now, the resolvins and protectins, that makes sense, resolving inflammation and protecting our tissues. But where do myricins come from? Well, I took a look into the naming of this specialized pro-resolving mediator, and it's at the bottom of the screen. It actually is a combination of the words macrophage, mediator, in resolving inflammation. So that's where the name comes from. So how do they work? Well, they do help all 3 steps. Now, I want to know, how do they do that? How do they help clean up the debris? Well, the specialized pro-resolving mediators, are also known as SPMs, support the activation of our macrophage. Remember, the macrophage are the gobblers. We talked about them in gobbling up pathogens, but macrophage will also gobble up debris, damaged tissue and protein. So that does help with the cleanup of the tissues. Step 2 is helping to balance that cytokine response. And the SPMs do help to balance the cytokines. So we don't have another tornado whipping through our tissues again. And then step 3 is supporting the renewal, the rebuilding, the tissue regeneration. How do they do that? Well, SPMs stimulate endothelial nitric oxide. That's going to support vasodilation to get more blood flow and nutrients to support that tissue repair. What's interesting about these SPMs, the specialized pro-resolving mediators, is because they're created from fat, the EPA and DHA metabolites, they actually work more locally versus when we talked about cytokines being proteins, they're a little bit more water soluble, so they can enter into the bloodstream and circulate to have more of a systemic effect. These are working right where we need it. So it's going to support blood flow to the tissue where the inflammation was. So a very specialized process in the body. Now, the majority of the research studies, which there's actually a lot of studies on specialized pro-resolving mediators, revolve primarily around resolving inflammation. However, there was a study that came out investigating the specialized pro-resolving mediator effect on our immune system. What the study was looking at more of the adaptive immune side on our B cells, the ones that create our antibodies. So this particular study was an animal study. They were utilizing mice. And they were also looking at vaccinations, like antibody creation from vaccinations. So they had two groups of mice. Both were getting vaccinations, but one was also getting the 17-hydroxydocosahexaenoic acid. So what they found when they were measuring the antibodies was that the group that did get the specialized pro-resolving mediators, they had a higher antibody production. Now, of course, we do need human studies to look deeper into whether the specialized pro-resolving mediators have a strong impact on our immune system. However, this preliminary study gives us some really nice, interesting information for future investigation. So no talk would be complete without at least talking about one hormone. In fact, there's a couple different immune modulating hormones in our body, but the one I wanted to point out was our sleepy time hormone, melatonin. So of course, melatonin is made naturally in our brain, in the pineal gland, and in our digestive tract. And of course, this is the hormone that regulates our circadian rhythms for helping sleep. However, it does also support our adaptive immune system. It supports both the T cells and the B cells. Now, what melatonin does is it helps to prime the T cells so they have a more efficient immune response. Now, there's also studies showing that melatonin helps to support antibody production as well. In addition to that, melatonin in of itself is a powerful antioxidant. Please don't forget the oxidative stress our body can be under, especially when we're exposed to pathogens. There have been specific studies on viral infections showing that melatonin can help to ease that high oxidative stress level. So please don't forget the importance of melatonin. Now, I would still suggest people, if they're going to support their melatonin levels, still taking it at night, 30 to 60 minutes before their bedtime. I wouldn't necessarily want to take this during the day when I'm trying to be active to support my adaptive immune system. So we're going to support it while we're sleeping. Now, last but not least, I want to talk about the gut immune connection. And of course, we're going to talk about probiotics. So this is our last topic, but I wanted to give a quick review of our microbiome. So our microbiome actually refers to or is defined as the trillions of microorganisms that are in and even on our body. Remember, we do have microorganisms on our skin as part of our natural flora. There's an estimated 100 trillion microorganisms found in just our digestive tract. And that's 10 times the number of microorganisms than what actually create the cells that create our body. Another number I like to memorize for myself is 70%. 70% of our immune system is found along the digestive tract. And it makes sense. If something foreign is going to come into our system, it's likely something we either inhaled or ingested. So it makes sense that there's a strong amount of our immune system located along that tract. Now, just to also define dysbiosis, it is an imbalance in our microbiome, so more bad bacteria than good bacteria. What can create this imbalance, of course, is poor diet, pharmaceutical medications like antibiotics, environmental toxins, and just basically an unhealthy sedentary lifestyle. But of course, our conversation today is mostly revolving around like the respiratory tract. So I wanted to point out that there are 6 studies that are connecting dysbiosis, so more bad bacteria than good bacteria in our oral and throat cavities that can make us more susceptible to respiratory infections. So there's now a connection between the microbiome of our mouth and our throat and our respiratory health. And the connection is actually our mucosa. So the mucosa is defined as the skin that lines the respiratory and digestive tract. What makes it a little different than our actual skin is that our actual skin is keratinized. The pink skin of our mucosa is not. Now, one of the important defenses of our mucosa, the pink mucosa of the respiratory and digestive tract, is actually mucus. Mucus does coat the mucosa and it creates like almost like a barrier. So if viruses were inhaled, the virus has to actually penetrate the mucosa or the mucus layer to get to our mucosa to create an infection. Now, there are studies showing that the good probiotics can actually colonize certain parts of the respiratory tract. But also, good probiotic bacteria can actually communicate with our mucosa and stimulate more mucus production. So good bacteria supports our immune defenses and creates a little bit more mucus. Bad bacteria actually makes our mucus layer thin. And here's one of probably the best examples of that is H. pylori. The lipopolysaccharide toxins on the outside of the H. pylori cell wall actually tell our mucosa cells that make mucus to slow down its production or stop the production of mucus, which is what creates the problems associated with the H. pylori. Now, let's talk about a study making this kind of gut respiratory connection. So, because it's really interesting how sometimes if we're taking in oral probiotics that are going to colonize primarily in our digestive tract, how it's having an effect on our respiratory health, which is, again, that connection with the mucosa. So for this particular study, researchers were looking at a special combination of probiotics, which includes Bifidobacterium lactis, the strain BS01, 2 strains of Lactobacillus plantarum, and 2 strains of Lactobacillus rhamnosus. They were also utilizing a prebiotic, which is like the beneficial fiber food that feeds good probiotics. So since those work so synergistically together, this combination is now being called a synbiotic. So when you see synbiotic in research studies, you'll know it's a probiotic in combination with a prebiotic. The one the researchers chose to use was galacto-oligosaccharides. So here's what the results were. Now, this study was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial carried out over 3 winter seasons. So this was a pretty big study, 3 seasons or 3 years of research with 250 healthy volunteers. So a nice large sample size. And they were monitoring them for the 90 days over winter for each of those 3 winter seasons. Now, they were utilizing this special combination of the probiotics and prebiotics, but they were using 15 billion colony-forming units. I put that in bold because oftentimes we think, oh, if we're going to be utilizing probiotics, we need big doses like 50 billion or 100 billion to have an impact. Well, what this study was showing is that we can get a very nice impact utilizing just 15 billion colony-forming units every day. Here's what the results were. So the most important one is actually in the orange box. So the symbiotic group compared to the placebo had a 75% reduction in developing the flu or influenza-like illness. So over those 3 winter seasons, 75% less chance of getting sick. Now, what if influenza-like illness actually means is, say you have all the symptoms of the flu. You go to your doctor, the doctor says, oh, you've got all the symptoms of the flu. They do a physical exam and say, yep, you have the flu, without doing the throat swab. So to get the diagnosis of the flu, you have to do the throat swab to see that the flu virus is there. Otherwise, if you're just diagnosing on symptoms, it would be considered an influenza-like illness. Now, compared to the placebo, the Synbiotic group had a 39% reduction in the number of colds developed. So less chances of actually getting sick. Now, the graph, the box is showing, well, what happened if they did get sick? How long were they sick? So the duration of the illness. So this is done in days. So what we're going to look at is the first 2 bar graphs. We have the blue, which is the placebo, and the orange, which is the probiotic or the Synbiotic group. Now, if the group did get a cold, the placebo group had an average number of days for cold of 5.97. So we'll just round up and say about 6 days. The Synbiotic group had an average of 4.95 days, or let's just round up and say 5 days. You might say, oh, 6 days versus 5 days doesn't seem like a big difference. But when we're trying to get back to work and feeling better soon, it does make a big difference. Now, in terms of symptoms, looking at coughing, the placebo group had an average of 7.33 days of coughing versus the Synbiotic group, which had an average of 4.25 days of coughing. So less days of symptoms. And in terms of just overall total acute upper respiratory infections, the placebo group had an average of 6.1 days versus the Synbiotic group of 4.71 days. So what this study was showing, at even what we might consider a relatively small dose of probiotics, the 15 billion colony-forming units, what we were seeing is that the Synbiotic group were less likely to get sick, but if they did, they had less days or less duration of illness. So please don't forget the importance of probiotics as well. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you joining in to listen. Please stay tuned for some upcoming webinars and podcasts. And thanks so much for supporting Life Extension. Have a great day.